The pointers that I'll make, there we go. The pointers I'm making really are aimed mainly at those that are about to embark on translational research with clinicians. It's not for those who have been around for a long time. You may not get a lot out of this, and you may either concur or disagree, I guess. So the first thing I want to point out is that there are actually different types of clinician researchers. And when you embark on engagement, you really should think about what sort of clinician researcher are you actually engaging with. It's also important that depending on what it is you want to achieve, you really should think about the clinician researcher. So for example, there's a clinician researcher whose core business is actually research that has a clinical load. So someone I would think of who's like that here would be someone like Peter Sawyer. And then you've got a clinician researcher whose core business is actually clinical work who has a research load. So that would be someone like myself. So my core business is actually still in the clinic. So 95% of my time is devoted to clinical care. And then you've got clinicians who are simply happy to help out on research. These are your AIs that you'll find in protocols. They'll help you contribute to accrual of patients or collection of samples or whatever it is you want to achieve in the clinician. You won't find them leading the protocol development. They may provide you with a bit of input, but these are your sort of clinicians that engage at that level. And then you've basically got clinicians who are not involved in research at all. And then you've got a clinician who's been trained but now works purely as a scientist. So it's worth knowing the type of clinician you're seeking to engage. And the best way to actually identify the right clinician for your research is to check their track record. And then really, when you come to finding the right clinician researcher, you really need the type. You need to think about there are different skill sets that clinician researchers bring. And so just because they're researchers, they may not be involved in the space or have the clinical or the skill set that you're actually needing. So you have clinical research, which are, produce essentially quality audits. So these are your typical retrospective analyses of outcomes. There may be some univariate or multivariate analyses that identify whether you're doing things well and how you might be able to do things better. And then you've got the type of research which is more hypothesis generating. This may be a retrospective analysis or simply a small prospective study. Then you move into that sort of translational research space, which is more about understanding or improving your biological understanding. It may be testing a potential biomarker or a diagnostic marker, or maybe testing a potential therapeutic agent. In my field, it's about either improving cure, reducing toxicity, or both. And then you go into that big practice-changing research. These are generally your prospective, randomized, multi-center trials. They're typically implemented through a collaborative trial group when they're investigator-initiated, and this is to allow you to achieve sufficient numbers for whatever hypothesis you're testing, or it may be industry-led, and this often helps provide the sufficient resources to achieve those goals. And so really, each study level requires a different skill set, and you really should bear that in mind when you're engaging with the clinician. Are you engaged, depending on where you want to get to, are you engaging with the right clinician who has the right skill set? So what does a clinician bring to the table in the engagement between clinicians and scientists? Well, we can help you identify the areas of unmet need, and that's really important. Many of us have very large databases which help us identify patterns of care and outcomes, and these can serve as a benchmark for new diagnostic or biomarkers or treatment interventions. We can help place potential roles for new discoveries. Where do they fit into the clinical domain? And we can help identify eligible patient cohorts. We help assist in trial design, and we can also access alternative sources of funding. But what's really important is that we're not just viewed as a source for tissue samples. We want to be engaged in the process. So successful engagement is about identifying the right clinician through looking at their track record. The proposal you have must be interesting, though. It has to be a worthy proposal. And it's good if, when you engage early, to actually identify what it is you want from the clinician and consider it a two-way process. You may come with an idea, it may be worthy, but it requires a lot of refinement to find the exact area in which whatever it is you're looking to research is placed appropriately within the clinical domain. And you know what's really good? When you first engage, if you consider a 1 or 2 page synopsis upfront, just send a 1 pager or 2 pages saying, listen, this is what I've got. I'd like to discuss with you a potential to do whatever it is. And that's really meaningful because you see, clinicians that predominantly have a clinical load are very time poor. We have lots of priorities and research keeps going, down the bottom purely because you're overwhelmed with the clinical load. So if you come in with a 1 or 2 pager, it helps us think about what it is you want really quickly. And then we can think about where can we place it, what it is you've got. And just another point is it's good because of that to send out subtle reminders about, where are you at? And don't contact, a week before a grant application is due and ask, could you please review this for me? Clinicians wish to be engaged in the process of discovery. While we may not be able to understand the nuances of what's happening in the lab, we don't want to find out about where you're at when the manuscript arrives and we're asked to please review. We want to be part of that process, and just keeping us informed allows us to remain engaged with the whole process and really leads to a successful collaboration. And this is the most important point. Translational research is a long game. Well-designed and executed clinical trials actually take time. So if you are going to run a successful partnership, it's really a long game. It's not a short game. And that's my little talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandro. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Josephine Forbes, who I suspect many of you know, but just in case you don't, Josephine is a Principal Research Fellow at Maher Research. Her area of interest is in diabetes and the complications in the kidney. And she is also the program leader of the Chronic and Integrated Care Program at Maher Research. Thank you, Jo.
And so thank you everyone for the opportunity to talk to you today. And I'm actually going to give a little bit of a remit from the other side of this. And thank you, Sandro, you really set the scene. In fact, it's quite interesting how many common messages that you'll find that we have. And so I guess one of the most important things is this 101 of your research proposal. What is it about and how can you describe it to someone as in the most succinct manner possible? So for me, it's about diabetes. It's only ever been about diabetes. And I'm interested in that because it's a global pandemic. In 2025, lots of people will have it in Australia. It'll exceed about 0.5 million people in Australia who have the complication of diabetes, which is diabetic kidney disease. It costs an extraordinary amount of money. Many of the deaths are in young people. We think about diabetes affecting older people, and therefore the people dying from diabetes are older. However, that's in fact not true. And more recent international data has in fact shown that many of these deaths are in people under the age of 50. We know that current therapies are not meeting the burden of disease. They're only slowing down diabetic kidney disease. Even these wonderful SGLT2 inhibitors, which are some of the new common therapies which we're using to lower people's blood sugar. And we know they also disproportionately affect vulnerable groups, and that includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and also younger people with diseases such as type 1 diabetes. No, that doesn't work. Okay. And so, as Sandro said, one of the most important things is understanding your end game. So what is this red bit over here? What's this red arrow on the end of your clinical journey? What are you actually trying to do? So most of us in the lab are thinking about, for myself, I'm thinking about therapies. How can I slow down the progression of diabetic kidney disease? And how can I arrest it before it actually occurs in someone with diabetes? So, okay, I've got a therapeutic target identified over there on the left-hand side. I've got an existing partnership with a company, or I've developed a spin-out company or something along those lines. I've done the preclinical testing to prove that it works in, for example, in an animal model, which is part of the regulatory process. Well, what happens next? There are a lot of steps which actually subsequently happen after this. Is there a biomarker for disease that you can look for in patients? Can you establish some kind of ex vivo idea, or can you use human samples to actually prove that this may be a pathway that's worth investigating clinically before you actually do some sort of clinical investigator-led study or a clinical trial? And then there is a huge process after that of clinical trials, and also to actually getting it into the clinic at the end game. So I would encourage you to actually get a little bit of a canvas like this. So this is actually for R&D, but it doesn't really matter. What this does is make you think about what your end game is. I encourage you to look at your research goals. Who's the team that needs to be involved? What actually is your translational pathway? Do you actually know how to get there? What's your research output? What, if you were to describe it to a person in one line, what does that look like? Who actually are the beneficiaries? You may think you know who's going to benefit from it, but actually, have you asked them? Have you asked the consumers whether they will take the medicine? Do they think it will change their life? And will the clinicians actually prescribe it to them in the first place? So how did I know who to talk to ask what and when to ask them? So one of the first things, and Sandro pointed this out, is to be a detective. You have to be a Google stalker. So you need to find out who is around the place and what they are doing. That is critically important. So Google stalker, first point. So one of the first things I'd encourage you to do is look for international experts, and you would be surprised at how many of these people are actually in your backyard. So these are some of the people who are in our backyard who I work with, and this one is particularly in our backyard. I don't know whether I'm pointing there. Yes, I am. So you'll know that David Johnson heads up Metro South Nephrology, and he doesn't mince words, and he's been a long-standing collaborator of mine. But the most important thing is that actually he writes most of the major clinical international guidelines in diabetic kidney disease and chronic kidney disease. So he is an international person who gets all of that feedback globally and can bring it back to us locally here at TRI. This is Kim Donahue. So in David not mincing words, when I first went to him 10 years ago and said, okay, David, I want to come into your clinic. I want to look at therapies for diabetic kidney disease. I want to think about your population. He said, it's too late. These patients, too late. What you're looking at, that pathway, it won't help them. And I was quite taken aback and thought, well, that's not what I wanted to hear, is it? But what he encouraged me to do was to think about the pathway and where I'm intervening. And so it's not as straightforward as you think it is. I'm looking at diabetic kidney disease, but actually I want to be talking to the endocrinologists and not the nephrologists. So the endocrinologists are the people who deal with early kidney disease in patients with diabetes and not the nephrologists. And so that was something that I had to learn in the process. Well, I thought it was a kidney specialist who dealt with people with kidney disease, but that's only once they reach a certain point. Who is involved in the large multinational clinical trials for diabetic kidney disease? So that's also something that's very important. And again, many of these in our own backyard, over at Maher Research at Maher Children's Hospital, a number of papers published in the New England Journal of Medicine looking at early diabetic kidney disease. So people like Andrew Cotterill and also Kim Donahue, who's also been involved in those studies. And as you know, some of these other clinicians. But something else to look for is at your national meetings, who's questioning the status quo? Who are the people who are getting up at your normal meetings that you go to for your clinical area? So for me, that's the Australian New Zealand Society of Nephrology meeting or the Australian Diabetes Society. Who's getting up there and questioning what's going on and why we're not making the right choices and why we're not addressing the patient gaps? And as Sandro said, succinctly present your research question and be open to a not so polite answer. The second most important point is find local champions and heroes, because these are the people who are, as Sandro said, there are different levels of clinicians. So these are the people who are the real stars of your clinical trials. They will help you understand what the clinic looks like. What does the workflow look like? If you want to collect this sample, how on earth are you going to be able to do that? Is there a population which fits the type of population that you need to look for? And they can help you identify where the best place is for that. They can lend feasibility to the design of your research. They can help you understand the advantages of particular patient populations or unique populations. And for me, that was these young people with type 1 diabetes who actually are developing diabetic kidney disease. And we have access to those patients at the Maher Young Adult Centre. That is a very unique international cohort. It's neither pediatric or adult, it's in between, it's a transitional cohort. And we have the capability in those young people to actually look at the development of disease and know which year after they develop diabetes are they in and how far has their diabetic kidney disease and cardiovascular disease progressed. They can also talk about the complexities of the research, make sure, and they can also make sure that you have reality checks, which is another really important thing. So meet these frequently for coffee conversations. And as Sandro said, also identify and ask them, how can you help them? Because this is not a one-sided discussion. This is a two-sided discussion. And you may have skill sets which you can offer to them. So this is just an example of some of the questions that we have been trying to answer. And as you can see, they are vast. They are enormous questions. They are big cohorts. They are asking all sorts of different things. And there is absolutely no way that I could answer these questions by myself. And so this is team science. You need to understand what you know and what you don't know and go out and find the people who can help you. One of the things that I've done is taken one of these things and sketched a detailed plan. So what does it actually look like? How do you get the funding? How do you think about the development of the drug? What are the steps that you need to take to get there? And just putting those out down on paper sometimes is enough to identify the glaring holes in your plan that need addressing, because often there are lots of holes and there are lots of red lights that you cannot actually pass. With respect to meeting with clinical researchers, one of the most important things is to do your homework before each meeting. Do not rock up to the meeting and expect to just be able to wing it. It's just not going to happen. They're really time poor. You need to have a very short agenda and you need to have addressed everything from the meeting before. They don't want to come into a meeting that's a groundhog of the meeting that we had last time. They want to see progress. Have your questions ready to go? Make sure that documents are there for signatures way before the meeting and bring the actual physical documents to the meeting for signing, because they don't want you coming into clinic later to sign them. They just don't have time. Also, subtly re-prompt people by providing the agreed action items 1 week before the meeting, just to remind them, and in a short email that they can easily see on their phone, hey, just reminding you, here, this meeting's coming. We agreed we'd do these things, just letting you know that this meeting's coming up in a week's time. The other thing is about interpreting. So we know that clinicians speak one language, scientists speak another, but they're not the only languages that we need to speak to actually do clinical research. We need to be able to speak regulatory language and commercial language if you're going to have a product, legal speak. And once you start to do ethics and governance applications and also agreements, you need to understand the nuances of that. Statistics and also lay and consumer language. So it's true that you will never become an expert in all of these things, but it's important to have a good understanding of all of these areas and to upskill yourself so that you can actually talk across all of those sectors, because somebody has to be the overseer in the research team of all of those things. And that's one of the things as a researcher that you can do. You have a little bit more time and you have a really good skill set as a basis to be able to be an umbrella across all of these things. Another important thing is to understand the red tape. There is always red tape. We know it's there, but you need to understand what it looks like and how it's going to impact your study. And particularly who can help you to get around it, because we all know that there are some people that are more effective at getting past red tape than others. And so you need to identify and hang on to those people and to help you move around those stop signs. Always try and leave individualized and targeted comments in the emails and margins that you want the clinicians to address. So when you send them documents, don't just send them the document. Send them a small email that says, hey, if you only have time to look at these things, these are the 3 things I really need your help with, and make sure that the document that's there has those highlighted. Hey, I don't understand what this means. Is this the right clinical description of this condition? What research space should I be referring to here? Is this the right paper which best describes this clinical problem? And practice articulating your case in front of at different levels. So as I said, it's not just about learning the language, but it's being able to articulate it to the right audience. So if you go into a commercial meeting, you speak that language, and then you can shift gear and speak a different language when you go into a different meeting. And just some final words. I find that someone needs to be the champion of the studies. So if it's your research that people are helping you out with, you need to be the champion. You need to be all over it. So you really need to push and subtly push to help everybody come together. You need to be the glue that sticks everybody together. You also need to understand, though, the limitations of your skill set and what other skill sets you need and need to encourage other people to get. If you can't find those skill sets, you need to train yourself in those skill sets to get them. And that's an ongoing process. Work through roadblocks and criticism systematically. You will find both of these things occur. Yes, write the email. Please don't send the email that you write after you get pretty strong feedback. Always write it. It releases the energy. However, then sit back and go, why did this person say this? Was I not clear enough? Did I not speak the right language? Did I not have enough knowledge to write the right case? Or, because usually it's about a lack of communication. And it's not about us that we're not good writers, it's just about who the audience is that we're trying to convince of our argument. Expect to get frustrated, but remember that you have a good job and it may help someone. So always keep coming back to that. You know, this is a good job. We're doing something positive for people. So, you know, don't forget that. Ask lots of questions and ask lots of questions and ask lots of questions. It's probably known in diabetes that I'm a person who asks a lot of questions. If I meet somebody who I know is an expert in something, I ask them a lot of questions, and they probably get quite frustrated. Probably not so much in the public forum, but I certainly have a list of questions for them in a more sort of private manner where I can ask them those questions. And definitely seek out experts and, as I said, ask them lots of questions. But this is team science. So just to do some of the studies, this is just one of the studies that we've got. This is the team which had to come together to actually put this together. And so I just want you to understand the scope of the type of engagement that you need to go to. And you are very capable of doing it because we do it every day with our other stuff. So this is the type of engagement that you need to have. And it includes funding bodies, it includes consumers, patients, clinicians, scientists, and that entire network to make these things come to fruition.
So thank you, Joe, and thank you, Sandro. We're now going to move into the Q&A discussion section. So Sandro and Joe, I might get you to come and sit on a couple of the chairs up the front. We've got a couple of additional panel members joining us in the room, and we've also got someone joining online. So first up, we've got Associate Professor Fiona Simpson, who many of you will know. Fiona is a Principal Research Fellow with the UQ Diamantina Institute and is involved in a number of research projects and clinical trials related to cancer. Michael Wagels. Michael's up there on my right, your left. He's a staff specialist plastic and reconstructive surgeon here at PA, and's been really made a name for his work in biofabrication. He's involved in the Hurston Biofabrication Institute and the Australian Centre for Complex Integrated Surgical Solutions here at TRI. Michael's a surgeon and has a strong collaborative relationship with both other clinicians and researchers as he looks at using tissue engineering for complex reconstructive defects. And also online, we have Rick Thompson. I hope Rick's online. Can we see the participants? Sorry.
I am here, but
hi, Rick.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I can't be there. I'd love to be there for sure.
So Rick has unfortunately become trapped on the other side of the New South Wales-Queensland border, but that hasn't held him back from being involved in today's seminar. He'd love to be with us, but the powers that be have decided that he's not allowed to cross the border at the moment, so he's going to join in virtually and sort of add his expertise and comments. So any questions from the floor? And Maher, I'll get you to come up and help me. We can do this Q&A together. Any questions from for either of the presenters or for the people on the panel? Everyone's very quiet. Sandro, I might start with you. What do you know now about translational research that you didn't know 5 or 10 years ago? So if you're, I don't know, your younger brother or a younger colleague came and said, Sandro, I want to go down the same, follow the path that you've passed, what advice would you give for a younger Sandro Porceddu?
So probably the advice I'd give is that success in research is probably through the inconvenience of others. And Joe showed that very last slide of all those people that were involved in just simply one trial. So it's really about, you can't take everything on. You will not achieve everything by yourself. You really need a big team around you. And the other thing about that is to engage with people who you clearly, or relative to years, have a good track record or have a good trajectory. And if you engage with those people and view it as inconvenience of others, and I mean it in a nice way, that's really the secret to success, I think.
Fiona, I might throw to you now. You've achieved a lot in your research career, but you've also been through just a little bit of pain along the way from time to time. If I ask the same question to you that I asked to Sandro, what would you say to a younger Fiona who came and said to you, look, I'm just starting out as an early career researcher. I want to do some of the sort of things that you do. What would your advice be to a younger Fiona?
I thought about it a lot actually last night, and I think it comes down to make it successful, it comes down to something really simple. I'm really impressed by like Joe's graphs and things because I'm completely random. I'm not that business person, right? But the common thing in everybody that's doing it is quite simple. They're not, the scientists in the hospital that are successful are not there for grant money, and they're not there for their KPIs, and they're not there for their promotions. They genuinely want to solve a problem in the clinic. And if you find the clinicians who, beyond every other concern, they want to improve outcomes for their patients, then you've got a winning team. Because any other differences and any other concerns and any other time pressures fall away because you're both genuinely trying to work towards the same thing. And if you've got that, then it doesn't matter how you approach it. If that's the goal, it works.
Question down the front. So I'll get you to speak up so everyone can hear.
So one of the things you talk about is actually the translational pathway you're running around. We're actually trained scientists and surgeons for medical people. And I can't help but sometimes what I see is more and more people having to do the translation side rather than the research side. And I suppose, what do you think is missing to help you do it? Because this is a big problem. We're trying to get academics or researchers to do everything. What support would be required to have helped you get there quicker?
So before that you answer that, I'm just going to paraphrase your question for the sake of the people online, just in case they didn't get it. And please correct me if I don't say this correctly, but where are the gaps and who's actually going to do the translating? Because I hope I'm interpreting this correct. Academic researchers and scientists are very good at doing academic research and science, and they don't always have the skill set. Who's going to be the one that's going to step up to the plate to actually do the translating? Joe, it looks like you're keen to...
I'm raring to go with that one. I guess, look, if you think about the pathway that the therapeutic is, which is one example that I showed you today of some of our interactive research, it started 15 years ago in terms of the discovery research component. But where it really trafficked forward was when we thought about those orange pathways in between. So I showed you the red pathways up the end where we think about the clinical trials, the regulatory pathways, but it's actually that little bit in between where you need to find a rationalization for the clinical translation of it. So some ways that you can do that are biobanks as an example. You can get some samples and see, for example, is your pathway even activated in those tissues? If you use your therapeutic in a smaller assay of some description where you have some PBMCs from a patient with diabetes with that disease, does it block that pathway? So getting some of those steps will allow you to make that next step. The other thing that I would encourage people to do is actually get some understanding of what's required for translation. And by what I mean by that is, what are the steps that are taken? So I'm talking about a therapeutic here, but they're quite different for different things. What are the steps that need to happen? So for example, we need pharmacology, preclinical research, toxicology, first-in-man studies, so you understand what that journey looks like, because every step requires certain particular data to make the next jump. And if you don't have that data, and that's why you need to be targeted, because we only have so much money, you have to be really targeted about which step you take next, because you can't just randomly choose. Then you actually are at the mercy of the FDA, the TGA, and those sort of entities.
You know, there's the issue around, you know, how do you build the collaboration? And a lot of that happens organically. You do find each other and you develop a protocol and assess feasibility. But the roadblocks that were here 10 years ago still exist, and they're the enablers that allow you to collaborate. So the chances that the collaboration is between two groups these days is almost non-existent. If you're going to create anything meaningful, it's going to be 5 or 6 different organisations involved. That's where it falls down, because many of us are time poor, and you've got to now negotiate the minefield of 5 different organisations coming in to sign a contract. So it's sort of this steering away from, you know, how do we create meaningful engagements between a clinician and scientist, because that's the topic for today. But what I think maybe you're getting at or asking is, how do we create the enablers to allow this to happen? And though I think we've only made small gains in that space, you know, every time you get an ethics approval, you're now hit with a whole bunch of new forms about governance. And it's, you know, personally, it overwhelms me when I have to work out, how am I going to get, you know, the universities, how are they going to agree on who's going to control the IP or something like that? It just becomes a nightmare.
Fiona's got a comment or a question.
To ask Michael Weigels, because I've watched him for years, since he was just a young lad. And now he's taking like people's heads apart and sticking in bits of plastic and doing all sorts of. So a lot of that is how the researchers kind of fit clinicians into their research. What do you see is the value in scientists, especially in something like you do?
As you pointed out, there's like this sort of building progression of knowledge and understanding, right? You can't just say, I'm going to do a clinical trial. You have to base it on something that came before, and that might be a first in human, or it might be animal studies. And even before that comes the basic science research, which should always be leading somewhere. And ultimately, I think, you know, that's what we're talking about is the clinical trials, right? I guess I've been involved in that kind of basic science research, understanding what I was wanting to do with the outcomes of it in 5, 6, 7, 8 years' time, which was ultimately to run a clinical trial and to be able to justify to myself and my patients that what I do to them is reasonable. So yeah, you kind of need everybody. Alan, did you introduce this? Does everyone know how important you actually are? Alan Rowan from AIBN, a UQ luminary. Yeah, I really like your question, which is kind of related, isn't it?
It is related because the relationship with
yeah.
With something, we have the wrong questions. And the one thing we do with clinicians, it's this passion to actually help people. When we turn up with something, they probably like our bit of science, and we turn up with their kids. And so it's actually going there to listen. We do that at HBI. It's not to go there with what we've got. It's to go there and say, actually, what's your problem? And then go back and say, well, we've got some knowledge which may be able to help.
But it's kind of both, isn't it? Because we love hearing about what you've got, because some of it we haven't actually really thought about. We've got like a stack of problems, as Sandro mentioned, in the backs of our minds, cases that we screwed up, would have done very differently if we had this, that, or the other tool, but we don't actually know what it looks like or what it should be made of. And you may actually introduce something to us that makes us go, oh, actually, I can solve that problem. But, you know, I think that, yes, it happens organically, but you can drive that just by putting everybody in the same space. And that's why HBI works well, is because we've got a space that is on a hospital campus, but not in the hospital. And we've got loads of basic science researchers, you know, loads of university people. We've even got commercial partners now in that space as well, because you can't run a medical device trial without a commercial sponsor, I don't think, not properly anyway. And yeah, suddenly everybody's there. Everybody's talking about much the same stuff. I learned some interesting things about material science and engineering, which has been really important in my pathway. And suddenly we're coming up with cool stuff that actually might work. So yeah, I think physical space is important. And TRI does it extremely well also.
And I think as scientists, you don't want to undersell yourself. The more you understand of the converse, the more you will understand like where you can be of value, like where your technology, for example, AIBN has a lot of nanoparticles and some of that really small nanotechnology, the materials, the fluid mechanics turned into ACCISS. You know, there's classic examples of where there's true pathways which will change practice that have started there. So don't undersell yourself. Yeah.
Listening is also a good point. I think I had just over 15 minutes of listening to Tom O'Rourke, who's a general surgeon, changed the entire approach and idea and everything I thought about pancreatic cancer, with some modifications from you and Walpole. 15 minutes from going down this track to that's actually not going to happen and you have to go. So given how much I talk, it's really surprising, but listening's really the important thing.
But it works the other way too, as we were saying, because clinicians have some crazy, stupid ideas that are absolutely not going to work. And they sometimes need to be reminded of that. Maybe.
John, I had a comment if I could jump in.
Go for it, Rick.
Yeah, so, yeah, just in relation to this area, and I think reflect. Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, just, you know, understanding and trying to figure out the structure in the clinical environment is, I think, the thing that I would say I've become much more aware of over the decades. And so I think when I'm talking to young people now, I'm really trying to make sure they look into that. And I think one of the key helpful enablers is facilitators such as Helen Benham and Michael mentioned TRI and the institution of that role as Director of Clinical Translation to help us interface with the hospital, and at the same time similar structures in the hospital. And for example, through Helen, we met Kanika, who's a research manager for orthopedics. And so then there's somebody to help us negotiate the structure there. It's not always obvious, and I think it's quite important to be sure we're engaging with the right people who can then help us find the others that we really need to talk to.
I might just mention a few of the questions that have come online, and then we'll take some more questions from the audience. First one is from Chloe Yap. How do you build the critical mass and gain traction, particularly if the initial ecosystem is smaller to begin with, for example, the Kidney Trials Network? And what time frame does that occur on? And that's open to everyone. Joe.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question. What was...
How do you build critical mass, particularly if there's a small critical mass initially between clinicians and researchers?
Look, sometimes the expertise is not right at hand. So I have another project where the expertise is almost entirely overseas. I think you have to put yourself out there, which is quite frightening. The person doesn't know who you are. They don't care who you are either, often. And you need to have that conversation, and you need to have that elevator pitch ready to be able to have that one pager, as Sandro said, but you need to be able to put it to them in 10 seconds of their time, and well, maybe a little bit more, a minute of their time, and make them understand why they might want to work with you. And so in type 1 diabetes, I think I've got something that can cure the disease, that will get their attention. Oh, okay, right. So, and then perhaps why. So Chloe, I'd encourage you to find out, you need to do the Google stalking. So you need to find out who the people are who are receptive to your area, and potentially if there's nobody who's doing frontier work in your area that is involving clinicians, then you need to go and convince somebody that that's a worthwhile exercise. So, which is not so easy.
So there's another question from Andrew Prowse, and he's directing this to all the panel members. I'm interested in submission of applications to TGA and the balance of responsibilities for preparing the application between the researchers and the clinicians. This sounds like this might be something for either Sandro or Michael. Who typically drives the preparation of these documents? Is it the researcher or the clinician? Does the responsibility shift from trial to trial? Do you contract it out to an external agency? What are the experiences of people in the room, and Rick also online? Who wants to tackle that?
So is this a TGA for what? For say a drug
device? Do you want to go medical devices first?
It could be a drug or do you want to start with medical devices, because it's a particularly separate category, isn't it?
It kind of is, but it kind of isn't. I mean, it's a very dynamic space. The regulation has only just recently changed. On the 25th of February, the TGA captured a whole bunch of things that previously were subject to a custom-made exclusion, which is particularly important in the biomanufacturing space. And it took them a while to work out what the implications of those changes were. So there have been even stepwise alterations to those changes. It's a very dynamic space, and it's hard to keep track of. But we'll just focus on TGA for clinical trials in the first instance, because I think that's what the question's targeting. Is that right? Rather than mainstream clinical service delivery. So essentially, if you want to use a medical device in a clinical trial, then you need to have a clinical trial notification. And this is where a commercial partner, which I referred to before, is extremely important, because it becomes the responsibility of the commercial partner, who is the manufacturer essentially of the medical device. If I am the if Metro North, Metro South is the manufacturer of the medical device, it's different. And I would imagine that the CTN responsibility falls with the manufacturer in that case. It's a process I've never engaged in. I never want to, because I can't imagine how complex it is. The commercial partners tell me it's actually quite straightforward, but what they find straightforward is very different from what I find straightforward. Because to me, the surgery is straightforward and they may not see that the same way. So yeah, as long as you've got CTN, your clinical trials notification, you then get a blanket approval to use that medical device in all instances or patients who are enrolled in that clinical trial. But you have to have done everything else first. So you can't submit for CTN approval until you've actually got HREC approval and you're on the RGO pathway. So does that sort of help?
Yeah. Sandro, you had a bit
so
of
it
experience
depends.
in this.
Yeah, it depends where it's coming from. So, for example, the phase 3 trials that I've led have been through a collaborative trial group. So through, for me, it's the Trans-Tasman Radiation Oncology group. And so they help facilitate that process. When I'm interacting with a pharmaceutical company, it'll be the pharmaceutical company that will help, but there'll be a clinician involved and you may be the PI clinician for that.
The really tricky thing is if you've got a novel molecule, and particularly if there's no commercial sponsor, that's a really hard thing. And I think there's not enough recognition within government and NHMRC of just how hard that is in the absence of a commercial sponsor.
Yeah,
that's really
but
tough.
you do, I mean, we are doing some of that at the moment. I guess the important thing is to make sure that all the steps are done, and you do have to have a particular package to be able to put in the CTN, and then you have to have some kind of safety and governance committee. So Maher has a phase 1, we have one here at TRI, who was Metro South, who cover those, and they will take you through those steps, which is all important. And they really do the hierarchy of who is responsible for what, because there are certain things that you can't be responsible for, obviously, as a non-clinician or as a clinician researcher.
Fiona wanted to make a comment.
So I did the CTN version for her phase 1 once everything was in place. But I had the experience where when I got stuck, I called the TGA and the head pharmacist phoned me up one night, led me through the whole thing, helped me with the entire form and the submission. And so I actually found the TGA extraordinarily helpful. I mean, spectacularly so, more than just about everybody else. So, and sometimes it's not as difficult as you might expect.
Okay, I think there's a question from Ranjini.
Ranjini, yeah, you've got to talk to so many different people. So that's sometimes quite hard. And I want to say to students that, because you always hear me talking all the time, I'm actually really terrible with people. I prefer to be with my knitting and my dog. It's really hard for me to come out in public. I feel awful for days afterwards. I feel like I've made a complete arse of myself. Dealing with senior male clinicians is sometimes fun when you're a short arse Highland female. But if you really want to do the thing, and the ultimate test of science is actually to translate and test it against real human disease, then you can get past it and you can put yourself out there and you can build the networks. You've just got to remember why you're doing it. So it's not about you or how you're feeling, it's because you need to get to that goal, right? So I know that's a surprise to a lot of you, but you know, I actually hate being out with people.
Can I add a comment or a quick?
Yeah, please do.
Just getting back to that critical mass, I just wanted to give a small example. You know, Researh and I have recently engaged in a skin cancer project. And the initial engagement was between he and myself, but you know, when we started to move into the clinical sphere, we brought in a whole bunch of people. So just a very small interaction has led to about 5 or 6 clinicians engaging with Researh on this one project. So you don't need to create the critical mass at the first interaction, it just evolves. And the people, like Ranjani's saying, everyone, if you're dealing with the right people, they already come with a network and bring in the right players to achieve the goal you set out to do. We took about 8 months to prepare it was about 8 months to prepare a protocol, and we achieved grant success at our first hit. So that's the type of time frame you really need. It's not a quick thing, you know, it needs a lot of, you know, we nutted it out over many, many Zoom meetings before we got the protocol.
I'll just add something to that. Talking to people is great. Absolutely collaborate, you know, till the cows come home. But in the last couple of years, I've learned 2 very important things. One is the importance of an NDA and the value of IP to some people. And it's very easy to make transgressions, even in a conversation or an email, that can create a mountain of paperwork, confusion, and unhappiness, and actually fracture what would otherwise be perfectly good working relationships. So do be a little bit measured about how you talk to people, what you reveal to them, how precious is your idea to you. And you know, you can actually use things like IP as a bargaining chip to get people involved, you know, if you're happy to hand the IP over, which most clinicians are perfectly happy to do. So that's all I'd say. Yes, collaborate, but just be a bit measured about it and get some advice if you need to.
But you can talk to people as much as you like.
That is absolutely.
I noticed we have David Bunker in the audience, who's probably in charge of the biggest network we have, and we've been talking about collaborations and networks. Just like to invite you to, if you have any comments or suggestions.
Yes, I will hold my question back for a little bit. I think Ranjani pointed out this network and how big that is. This is an ongoing work for BFE to understand how we're building on the things a big part of the strategy is, I guess, there's a key part of BDF strategy to make the business translation easier. A lot of what we talked about today is part of that. The opportunity to streamline some of the process. We could just do that and nothing else. We have a much better system. I think we lose an opportunity. Very important, but if you look at other industries, they really kind of sort of lock this out. Big opportunities. I really just want to give them very much value. Our approach is still work that.
So just arose from our conversation yesterday, there's an important point in that where we used to go into MDTs and clinics and everything else, there are now barriers and paperwork being put in place as to whether the scientists can go in and is a confidentiality agreement enough. And I thought, there's a point where you put so many barriers in place. Having scientists go into clinic, most of them are under really strong ethics. They have a good understanding of ethics. They're sensible people. Why the hell would you not have them in there? We've got people in North Queensland just now selling sheep ivermectin, telling people it's also got Viagra in it to treat COVID. I don't know why you'd sell dick medicine from Pfizer for COVID instead of using Pfizer medicine for COVID, but you know, I mean, they're selling illegally. There's all kinds of bizarre things going on. And we're sitting here in a situation where people are like, oh, should we let the scientists in there, the patients? There's limits to how much administrative red tape you can put into place. And in Australia, it's incredible. And it's stopping all forms of entrepreneurship, from business to science to medicine, everywhere. So anything you can do to reduce that will stop us all leaving the country.
I might just follow up a comment on what David was mentioning about trying to fix governance as a sort of a big aim that BDHP's got. And I think what I'd bring it back to is Sandro talking before about spending 8 months putting a protocol together for a clinical trial. If I was doing something like that from scratch, I would have the scientists, the clinicians, I'd have someone who knew about sample size and power calculations and statistical analysis, but I would be inviting a governance person to sit in on some of those protocol discussions, not necessarily to interrupt and tell people what to do, but just once the kind of protocol was coming to a sharp and pointy end, say, okay, if we do it this way, you're going to run into 10 roadblocks. If we do it this way, there's only 1 or 2. What do you think about going this way? Or trying to troubleshoot some of the problems in advance rather than getting your clinical trial funded and then spending the next 12 months trying to get governance approval to actually get started. So I think there's a real need for people to realise that there is expertise in governance, and inviting that expertise and seeing them as people that can contribute kind of earlier on in the phase of protocol development rather than doing it and then trying to adapt it later on.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment, but maybe things have changed, but initially governance people never wanted to know about you until you had ethics approval.
Yeah, well,
so maybe you're championing a new approach, which I would welcome actually, because you're right.
I think that idea of ethics and governance being sequential, I think we've got to move on from that.
Yeah, I
should
agree.
be in parallel.
Yeah.
Sorry, Michael.
No, like absolutely. I think, I mean, it's all those processes are there for a reason. And I think what's needed is not necessarily to wholesale dismantle it or remove roadblocks, but just to provide a support team who can help you negotiate them better. So, you know, the translational trials team here are unbelievable, right? If I was trying to run and being a surgeon, we're not that au fait with clinical trials. We're quick to criticize research that isn't a clinical trial, yet most of us know absolutely nothing about setting one up. And so just to have someone to guide you through step by step what each of the acronyms are, and then remind you what each of them are each time you forget what they are, because that happens over and over and over again. And yeah, maybe it is sitting back and watching sometimes, but for someone who's naive, it is actually, now what you need to do is sign this piece of paper. And now you need to read this and make sure that you're happy with it. And then you can move on to the next step. And helping with the negotiations with the commercial partners, which again, most of us surgeons are quite naive with, other than that they bring you your coffee when they want to sell you an implant, you know what I mean, the operating theatre. It's a different relationship in a clinical trial to the one that we're used to. And I know in medicine, you're probably a bit more practiced at the clinical trial stuff, but surgeons are definitely not. I mean, I can't thank the translational trials team enough for getting the 3 up and running that we've got so far. It certainly wouldn't have happened if it was down to me. And it often is down to the clinicians or the scientists. And I don't know, I can't speak for scientists, but I feel like some of the basic science researchers are also a little bit clinical trial naive. Most people don't get how much is involved in putting it together. And I don't think it rests with one or other. If we're going to jump across the valley of death, we kind of all need to do it together. And we need teams of people to help us fill out the right piece of paper in the right order. So I'd love a translational trials team, David. And I know we've been talking about this over at Metro North, not to do all the work, but just to guide you through it so you don't screw it up. When you make a mistake, it costs months, right? It absolutely does. I've certainly been guilty of that.
Can I just add one further comment just relating to both understanding the workflow of the clinics that you're going to do the clinical trial in, because that's particularly important. So for example, we're working with teenagers. So they don't want to give certain samples. They don't want to be there at a certain time of the day. They have 1,000 other criteria that you need to meet. They'll only come in once. So you need to understand that. And a classic example of that was an example of an inhaled therapy for diabetes. It was some sort of inhaled insulin, I believe. Ranjani might know better than I do. Came to fruition. They did a wonderful trial, but they did not consult the young people, and they had to use a very large device to actually give it, you know, like the spacer that you use for Ventolin. They would not use it. They would not take it. And because that consultation had not happened, all of that billions of dollars that got spent was wasted because they did not consult those teenagers nor their parents about whether they would carry it. Where do you carry a device like that when you need to have it so many times a day? So I think both the workflow from the clinical perspective, so the nurses who run, so the administrators who run the clinics are marvelous sources of information about how the workflow goes. And similarly, the consumers who are on the other side have to be in the pointy end of those protocols and of the design of anything that comes out thereafter. It's key.
I was going to add, nurses are great.
We are over time, so I might just make the last comment. I think Scott's got a question.
Look, just we've got 4 clinician scientists applying species on the platform today.
I'm not dying yet.
So I'm interested in basic scientists. How have you found it successful for the next generation in work? So clinicians in training talk a lot about developing relationships with senior clinicians. What about the next generation? How should we do that?
Yeah, so I've got a lab full of them. A couple of surgeons, a pathologist who's actually fully qualified, and I'm not sure if she counts as junior. And we've had a few catching them while they're PHOs, because these days their progression in their careers is highly delayed. The Royal Colleges are minimising numbers. They're making them queue up for 3 years. When I first had clinicians in the labs, they needed to have started their masters, then they needed to have finished the masters. Now they're looking at having to have full PhDs just to get in. So these young ones are being pushed to a level of qualification that none of the senior people making those decisions for them were ever pushed to. So for us, having them in the lab at the time, and what we tried to do is match them up with one of the science PhD students. So James Nightingale, who's an ENT PhO at the moment, matched up with Benedict. And what we're trying to produce is future surgeon scientist teams or future pathology breast surgeon teams with the scientists, so that as they go forward, the clinicians can be clinicians and the scientists can be scientists, but they all know how to talk to each other.
And so I have quite a different approach. So I quite regularly speak at the nephrology meeting here at PA. I also speak at Queensland Children's to the endocrine group, so the paediatric endocrinologists, and also to the endocrinology group over at Maher. And the purpose of that is to ignite their passion, because they can see the basic science, they understand it, and then they can see where we've gone with that and actually taken it to fruition. And they feel that they want to be part of that. In fact, one of my my new physician scientists is over here. And so I think it's really important to ignite the passion, because they do have the science at heart and they do want to help them. I mean, obviously there are different types of clinicians, as Sandro pointed out, but you want to reach out to those who really do have that passion and ignite it, because and then you want to give them opportunities. So that's the other part, is being there regularly. So for example, in MIAC, which is the Marty Young Adult Centre, I actually include them on papers. I involve them in recruiting patients. And even though it's a small thing at the start, it actually builds their track record. And so once they do have a small amount of track record, they also have the capability to get small grants for questions that are important to them, that I have nothing to do with. So, and so trying to build that. I mean, I only have a small capacity to do that, but I try and do that. I just think that's the right thing to do. Yeah.
Okay, we might just leave it at that. Thank you very much for those final comments. Before we end it, I just want to put in a quick plug for the 2021 Link Showcase, which is next week on the 16th in this auditorium. And there'll be a number of established clinician scientist collaborations that will be talked about at a sort of primer, as well as a number of people who are putting in at the showcase their ideas for what they'd like to put in for the final applications. The applications will open the next day, and I believe they are the closing date in the beginning of November. And thank you all for your contributions. Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Joe.
Yeah, likewise.
Very good. I have patients who wanted to hug me, and I was just, I'm like, "Oh, get away." I was thinking with